There we go. Thanks, Demario. So it looks like there's a Zoom link now in the chat, in the Teams chat. So our agenda today, we're going to review goal and objectives. We're going to talk about one more financing scenario or development scenario, a light tech conversion to a co-op. At 10, we'll be joined by some members from UHAB, and we'll watch a video about the Seabury Co-op. That's a case study exploration of a sustainable co-op. We'll outline some key sustainability and then transition into discussion, comments, and questions, and then talk about next steps. So as just an overall reminder, our goal is as a task force is to examine housing cooperatives and as an option to address the affordable housing shortage. And this has a few different objectives that we've been addressing over the last few meetings, and we'll address in the recommendations and report to identify developers and sponsors interested in housing cooperative development and expand those housing options, to review some of the existing funding systems and determine applicability to housing cooperatives, and then to build off of that work and our lived knowledge and expertise and recommend some new programs and systems. So as a fun, we've been working together for a few meetings now, and as hopefully a quick and fun way to build our additional trust and capacity and relationships with one another, I thought we would take a moment to introduce ourselves. So come off of mute if you can. Tell us who you are, what organization you're with, and if you can, a brief personal connection to shared ownership or shared living. I'm happy to start since I had a little bit of extra prep time on this, and we'll go popcorn. So after you finish, please call someone else that you see to participate in the chat. And if you're not sure who's gone and who hasn't gone, that's okay. Everyone could just come off of mute if you haven't had a chance to participate yet. So I'm David Feinberg. I'm with Chicago Community Loan Fund. We are one of the partner organizations with the Center for Shared Ownership Program. I'm our Director of Coaching Knowledge Transfer. And the first home that I bought in Chicago is in a condo building. So I live in a condo with my family, and we've been living one form of shared ownership and shared living basically since we've been homeowners in Chicago. So that's my personal connection to shared ownership. And I see Jen on my screen. So Jen, I'll invite you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so good morning, everybody. I'm Jen Parks. I'm the Executive Director for Habitat for Humanity Chicago. My relationship to shared ownership, it really comes from my professional work in that we worked with a cooperative here with a building in this in Chicago that we had developed in the early 1990s, and in 2015 helped turn it into a limited equity cooperative, and then have stayed in touch and continue to do technical assistance with them. So that's my connection. I will turn it over to Audrey.
Hi, good morning. My name's Audrey Thomas, and I am a member of the Logan Square Cooperative, which is a limited equity co-op in Avondale. And we have lived here together in the Logan Square Cooperative, an 8-unit building for almost 25 years. And I will go to Joy.
Hi, I'm Joy Adugate, and I'm with Bickford Equity Development Corporation and president of the Chicago Rehab Network. And I lived in a housing co-op when I was in school, in college in Madison, Wisconsin. That was my first experience or exposure to co-ops. Bickford developed and managed the Woman Washington Co-op for many years, and then developed 2 co-ops after that with low-income housing tax credits, which was a very different experience, which I know I'll be talking a little bit about today. And I'll send it to Kevin Jackson.
Thanks, Joy. Good morning, everyone. Kevin with the Chicago Rehab Network and Center for Shared Ownership. I really enjoy the work that's underway. And I think there's a whole new lane opening up in cooperative housing and the shared ownership stock and what we need to see happening with affordable housing. And I will send it on over to Renee.
Good morning. My name is Renee Hatcher. I she, her pronouns. I am a law professor at UIC Law School, where I direct a clinic called the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic. We essentially provide free legal support to co-ops, including housing co-ops, mostly almost entirely startup housing co-ops, in addition to other types of cooperative entities. And I am also the co-director of the Community Wealth Building Initiative, or the Chicago Community Wealth Building Initiative, or ecosystem. All right, lots of words. And the first property I ever purchased was a membership in a housing co-op here in Chicago. I was a member of Harper Square Cooperative for quite some time before moving to where I now live, which is a 2-flat condo here in Bronzeville. And I will pass it to Jenna. Or I can pass it to, let's
She
see.
did say she couldn't come off mute, so she's putting her intro in the chat.
Okay, great. I'll
Jenna
pass.
said, yeah, Jenna says she's a researcher with the Chicago Community Wealth Ecosystem Building at UIC and have loved learning about housing cooperatives through her wonderful colleague Renee. Hope to live in one day as well.
I will then, thanks, Jenna. I'll popcorn it to Demario.
Perfect. Demario Green, I'm the Policy and Government Relations Director for Chicago Community Loan Fund, which is a part of CSO. As far as a personal connection to co-ops and condos, I grew up in a condo, but I'm a DC native, so still figuring out the Chicago experience. And I can popcorn it to Kristen. Have you gone?
Nope. Hi, I'm Kristen Kamara. I'm a vice president at the Resurrection Project and oversee our homeownership initiatives and CDFI. My personal connection to shared ownership, I've owned 2 properties in my life. I currently live in a single family home in Lincoln Square, but before that I owned a condo with my husband for 10 years in Uptown. So that's that. I'll pass it to Steph.
Morning, all. I'm Steph O'Connor. I work at the Department of Housing on the homeownership team. I live in a condo now, and I used to live in a single family home, but it was like intergenerational with a lot of family members kind of coming and going. I definitely missed that a bit, even more like a co-op type living situation. So excited to be here and to meet a lot of you. I will pass it to Hanan. I haven't gone yet, right?
Good morning, everyone. Hi, Steph. Nice to see you. And Rachel, it's a pleasure to put a face to the name. My name's Hanana Youssef. I'm a program manager. I work as a program manager for the Cooperative Development Foundation, which is based in Washington, D.C., and helps support the development of co-ops in sectors that are niche or particularly challenging for co-ops. Housing is one of those that we're working on right now. I am based in Chicago. I live in the Edgewater neighborhood. I've been working in co-ops for the better part of the last dozen or years or so, primarily internationally through the International Cooperative Alliance and its regional bodies, and through a university in Canada that does a co-op MBA. I'm delighted to be learning more about what's happening in my backyard. I will popcorn it to Taylor. Sorry if you already went.
I did not. Good morning, everybody. I am Taylor Jackson. I am in a fellowship with CCLF. I'm now just learning a lot about community development and what affordable housing and small business practices are. So I am excited for this opportunity. I was in a previous cohort called Change Collective, and I was doing work on community building. And one of my cohort members thought that this would be a great opportunity for me to segue into this career or industry. So thank you all for having me. Oh, my background is I live in Evanston. I just moved back to Evanston. I was living in Portage Park for a little bit, living with family. My mom does own a 2-flat, so it has been nice to be here and be closer to family as well. But I look forward to learning more and developing more as well. I will pass it to James Yellen. Not sure if you went already.
Oh, thanks. Good morning, everybody. My name is James Yellen. I'm at Enterprise Community Partners. I work on our National Upward Mobility program, where I do a lot of work nationally with various forms of community ownership and shared equity, a lot of community land trusts, but housing cooperatives as well. So that's my work and somewhat personal relationship to it. I also served on the board of San Francisco Community Land Trust for a few years, which is a land trust in San Francisco that is aiming to steward multifamily home ownership primarily through the limited equity housing cooperative model. So that's sort of another way I've engaged. I will pass it to Janae. I don't think Janae's with
us. Hi, this is Janae. I am with the Center for Shared Ownership. My connection with shared ownership. I've been part of shared ownership all my life. Father starts shared businesses, cooperative businesses, as well as at present I live in a condo in Hyde Park. I will bounce it to M. Griffin. Have that person spoken as of yet?
Mary said she can't go off mute, so I'll just read what she posted in the chat, that she's the ED of the Cooperative Development Foundation, a national nonprofit with an affordable housing initiative, working with UHAB and other groups to promote and elevate affordable housing co-ops. She's been working in co-ops for 20 years and was a member of a food co-op in the 80s. And on behalf of Mary, she'll pass it over to King.
Hi, I'm King Harris, board chair of IDA. I live in a co-op. Actually, I'm the chair of the co-op. And I don't know, my screen, who have we missed?
I think King, we've captured everyone. So thank you
Dana
all.
hasn't gone. Dana?
Oh, Dana. I'm sorry about that, Dana.
Fine. Hello, everybody. I'm Dana Wallace. I work for the Center for Shared Ownership. I am the administrative assistant. It's nice to see everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for taking a few moments to share your personal and professional connections. I wasn't counting exactly, but collectively amongst this powerful group of 18, we probably have somewhere between 250 and 300 years of personal and professional experience with co-ops and shared housing. So it's just think about that and the expertise we all bring into this room and this group. So thank you all for that. Moving back to the next part of our agenda, we're going to hear a little bit about one example, one development scenario of a co-op that we didn't really touch on during our last meeting. I think we're going to hear both from Jen and Joy to talk about their development experience with LIHTC conversions to co-ops. So Jen, I have you kicking it off and then passing over to Joy.
Sure. And David, I didn't bring slides, so just heads up. I'm just going to kind of walk through a little bit of the history here. So,
Excellent.
Yeah, so Habitat Community worked back in the early 90s, and this is before I was at this Habitat. So a lot of the history, what I know from those early days, has been picked up through just the research I did once I came to Habitat Chicago in 2011-12. And so back in the early 90s, Habitat acquired an SRO in the Edgewater neighborhood and rehabbed it into 18 apartments. And it was a LIHTC development. And so at the beginning of that time, they did train all of the initial residents that it was going to be a cooperative, that it was going to be an ownership-based entity. And they did a lot of cooperative training in the early days. But then as you can imagine with the LIHTC, it can't turn over into ownership until after the 15 years expires. So there was very little turnover of the residents. A lot of the residents from the early days stayed through much of that time. There was a little bit of change, but most of the folks stayed. And then this is a little bit, it's just kind of a little bit of an interesting story. I mean, I showed up in 2011 and I received a letter from the residents of the building. And they said, we were promised to become owners and we're not owners and we want, what's going on? And so at that time, we did not have, Habitat Community was going through a changeover. We were fixing some things. And I was like, who are these people? What is this building? And so I went out and I met with the residents of the building and started to learn about the history and what was going on at that building. So it had just been basically treated as a rental property all through those years with, property manager, talking with Ida about reporting and all of that sort of stuff because Ida was a financing partner. And fast forward to, as I started getting involved with them, we started to have a conversation of, do you want to become owners? And so if you do want to become owners of the building, like what might that look like? And so we engaged the help of Jeff Leslie at University of Chicago and Linda Green to help us have that conversation with the residents in terms of what's possible and looking at models. Should it be a condo? Should it be a cooperative, a limited equity cooperative? What's going to be affordable? What would be the changeover in financing and moving on that front? So we did that evaluation. Ultimately, the residents of the building and decided they did want to turn into a cooperative, a limited equity cooperative, and that the financials model that was put forward said this is feasible. We did need to go and get we did need to go into the loan. So we went to CCLF and secured financing for the roof was in need of an entirely new roof was needed for the building. So we did a roof repair or new roof on the building, and then also financing the close of the property, and then the transition of it from Habitat Community owning it to the members, create the membership structure and the members owning it. And so in 2015, it converted to a limited equity cooperative. Our role shifted as Habitat Community from an owner and to a financing partner, but as well as a technical assistance advisor. We had advanced funds prior to the development, so they still owe us money on what we advanced in prior years. At the same time, they had their loan with Ida and their loan with CCLF, which was the Ida loan was part of the original financing of the building, and then CCLF for the new roof and financing close. And then we went through training and getting everybody's memberships established and all of that over the course of several months. And then fast forward to today, we continue to provide technical assistance to them. They have since then paid off their Ida loan. They've also paid off their CCLF loan. I will say one of the biggest challenges, which I'm sure is nothing new to anybody on this call, is property management. They've gone up and down with property management over all of the years since they've converted, and are still trying to figure out how to be a solid board. And it's something that we've been in conversation with them and how to help them. It's 18 apartments, so it's not like you've got 100 units to it's 18, so it's a smaller cooperative, and so the leadership pool is not as wide as a larger cooperative. That said, they meet regularly. The board meets regularly, and they're very committed to the building. I think I'll pause there and see if there's anything else you all would like me to share about the Winthrop Cooperative.
Thank you, Jen. That was an incredible and awesome overview, and obviously very prescient. I'm going to ask Oh, I see a question from Mary. Do you have any info on the tenure on owners or residents?
Yeah, I would, I would need to go into the records. When we converted, it was like 18 units. So I would say 16 to 18 were longtime residents. I would say now we've had more turnover over the last 4 years. So of the original, there's probably 10 original residents and about 8 that have turned over and shifted over time. Some folks have just decided that they wanted to move on into other opportunities. And so then they invite new people to join the cooperative. But there's still quite a number. Majority is still longtime residents.
Thanks, Jen. And I'll ask that if we have additional questions, we could post them in the chat and come back to Jen and Joy after Joy talks a little bit about her experience and Bickerdike's experience with their LIHTC conversion. So feel free to continue thinking about your questions, posting them in the chat. Joy, the floor is yours, and thanks for joining us today.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good morning. So as I mentioned in introductions, Bickerdike has done has a few different experiences. And I want to talk about the oldest experience, which actually happened before I came to Bickerdike, and I've been with Bickerdike for more than a minute. Most people know. At the time, in the Wicker Park area, which was a very different community than it is today, some 30 plus 35 years ago. There was two side-by-side courtyard buildings that were in the heart of a Black enclave community in Wicker Park, and the building was a Section 8, or the property had a Section 8 contract, and that was going belly up. And a number of us, Bickerdike, North Avenue Day Nursery, predominantly were the two organizations that worked very hard on preserving the affordability of the building and through a co-op conversion. So the Section 8 contract stayed with the property at the time of the conversion, and many of the original residents all stayed. And this was an operating co-op when I came to Bickerdike a whopping 29 years ago, and it continues to operate today as a co-op. We managed it for many, many years, and eventually they went with TaylorMade that manages other co-ops, and something that we were very happy about for them and for the experience of co-op management. But that board was very active for all the years that we managed it. I cannot imagine that it is not an active board. They've never had a problem having a legal election or interest in people running. I think probably the most serious issue that we dealt with, other than, the day-to-day management stuff that happens, is it occurred to the original attorney around the time that Bickerdike was a management transition, and he became very concerned that there was nothing preventing the co-op from paying off the mortgage and selling the building and just dividing the proceeds, and because it is in Wicker Park. And at that point, we didn't have a lot that we could do about it, but I'm happy to say that it is the fact that it has not occurred, and I don't think it will occur, is that people want to live in a co-op, and they're not interested in, selling and making money off of it. And I want you to hear that, because we become obsessed with this idea that real estate should yield equity and money and profit. And I think that I prefer, in my many years of working in housing in different roles, that housing is a place to live, and it's a place to build and a foundation from which to flourish. And so we were very interested in developing co-ops, and unfortunately it was not a time like today. Although there have been many co-ops in Chicago, and there were many co-ops at the time, But for whatever reason, the leadership in our government partners and the experience was just not there in developing limited equity co-ops. And with LIHTC, with the low income housing tax credit. And so we sort of broke some ground in late 1990s and early 2000s to develop two co-ops. The first one is an 87 unit co-op in Humboldt Park, and the other is a 31 unit co-op in two buildings. The Harold Washington, I'm sorry, the Harold Washington Unity Co-op is 87 units in 18 buildings. Holy cow, right? And the other is 31 across two buildings. And so we developed them at a time when I think all the conditions were right. Although we did not have the support for co-op development from our government partners. And as a matter of fact, in the second co-op that we did, they wouldn't even, we couldn't even get agreement to allow us to charge a share price, because they said that it wasn't allowed by the low income housing tax credit, even though we had done it on the previous building. But probably more importantly, we were developing cooperatively with the Chicago Mutual Housing Network, which some of you will be familiar with, if not directly, at least having heard about them, because the Mutual Housing Network was very involved in mutual housing and providing support for mutual housing and including and especially co-ops. But unfortunately, they were not at a great moment in their existence. And while we were developing, in fact, we shared an ownership interest. They were very involved in the first co-op initially, and then by this time we had done the second co-op just a couple years later, they had ceased to exist. And I want to say this because I want to make a point that I think is really key. Number one, co-ops work. I think I'm in a crowd of people who believe that. Many of you live in co-ops or have lived in co-ops, but they also require a specific level of attention. And I think one of the biggest challenges was that we did not have, I think, somebody like the Chicago Mutual Housing Network that could really provide that technical assistance and work with the residents at the initial formation of the co-op. And so we did, we also had co-op experience in the organization between Michael Burton and myself, and a surefire willingness on the part of our property management team. But we could not, the pressures of the low income housing tax credit and meeting occupancy deadlines within that, magic time period. I think, all of those things work together to make it very difficult to do the initial setup and engage in the successful operation of those two co-ops. And I'm very sad to say that both of them had to be deconverted. And so I want to be a part of the co-op conversation because I think, I continue to be very committed to co-ops and share that experience, not just as a lesson learned and a cautionary tale, but just to say it is so important to, just like we set up our, people that buy single family homes for the first time, we set them up for failure. We have them go through home ownership classes. We have them do stuff. I think that we go in with our eyes wide open. There are lots of different kinds of co-ops, and we don't talk enough about them in Chicago. I think the last 3 years have really blossomed for the co-op, the existence of co-ops, and recognizing how many co-ops there are in the city of Chicago and how successful co-ops have been. And I, for one, also am extremely pleased to be a part of the Center for Shared Ownership and laud the leadership of the Rehab Network and the Chicago Community Loan Fund for their work on pulling this together. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joy. Well, I want to make sure we have a few moments to ask questions and discuss what Jen and Joy have shared about some of their work and their buildings. And I'll kick it off by reading a few questions in the chat and a few answers that have already been posted. So there was a question: is residents transition ownership of their interests? How did new members secure share loans? Jen answered, for Winthrop, the residents were able to use their security deposit towards their membership fee. Membership fee is kept very low, $942 for a 2-bed, $1,087 for a 3-bed, since it's limited equity co-op. There was actually not a need to get share loans in that situation. Then Joy started talking pretty much about this next question. Was ongoing capacity building and training provided to the board upon conversion? If so, who provide the training? What do they consist of?
And can I just say, I'd love to say, I think that question is an excellent question, and I would answer it by saying, from the moment you begin the co-op, that's when this conversation starts. And because it is, people have their share. And I happen to think that was one of the difficulties in Harold Washington Unity Co-op, that we could not make the share purchase mandatory, but in the other co-op it was. I think that conversation starts right away, so that by the time you get to year 15, you're not only are your residents ready, they have a legal co-op board, they've been operating as a co-op, but, and they begin to talk about, what that transition means and what it means for management, assuming that it's has an outside manager. But it's also important to keep your government partners in that conversation, because you also are going to be transitioning them out, and they have staff turnover. And so you make sure your documents are really, really clear about their, taking them out and the conversion, that the loans can be assumed by the co-op corporation from the limited partner owner, and then that transition successfully takes place. And Jen may be able to add to that, because she sort of saw that in place, but we did a lot of planning around it.
Yeah, I would say, I think those are all excellent points. I think that the challenge that Habitat really was not, through just leadership at Habitat, after it became, long before it became Cooperative, in those 15 years of, while it was, still in kind of more affordable rental, those conversations did not go on for those 15 years. So, while the longtime member, people definitely had the memory of like, we were going to become owners, why are we not owners? The process of knowing what it would become to become owners, or all the financing partners, like that was a whole re-education that we had to go through as we were evaluating, could this building become a cooperative or a condo, and bringing into the conversation, let's talk about the fact that IDA is a financing partner, and there's affordability requirements on this building, and those affordability requirements are going to extend up through 2024, and so we had to really bring the whole, all the membership up to speed, all the residents, and then as they become members, up to speed on all of that history, so they would understand that there's these other entities involved. And then, working with IDA, once we started looking at conversion, we had to be in close communication with IDA of like, okay, this is what we're looking to do, and, walk that through with IDA, because again, it was it's just cooperatives aren't something that is as common as, and hopefully it'll become more common. It hasn't been as common. So there was a whole education with IDA as we were looking at this conversion as well. And I would say it needs to be ongoing. I still have conversations with the board to this day at times where they're like, now, who are these, and so it's like constantly just reiterating. It's documented, we give it, they all have handbooks and everything, but it's it's not as present to their lived experience, which is day in and day out, is going about normal life. And so it's just, helping to make sure that there's access to the information at all times, and reinforcing, here's where you can find that, and walking with them through that learning.
Thanks, Jen. Great point. All education is re-education. Mary had another question, and then I want to open it up to a few more questions. Mary's question, I know Mary is unable to go off mute. What was the transactionally, what was the transaction from LIHTC to Limited Equity Co-op? Did Habitat as owner transfer to the co-op as owner? And what payments were made and how to pay off the LIHTC? Does that mean?
The 15 years had well expired. I mean, we were actually well beyond the 15 years when we were having this conversation. And so the tax credits had expired by then. And I am not a LIHTC expert, so let me just put that completely very front and center. We are home ownership at Habitat, and I've learned a lot about cooperatives and working with Winthrop, but I know very little about LIHTC. So when I entered into the conversation with the residents of the building, and bringing in technical expertise from Mandel and Linda Green, it was to help us understand what, who are the players, what do we need to think about here. But the tax credits had long expired, and so Habitat is, in essence, was the owner of the building, this rental building. And so then we had to go through the process. So then we ended up being the one to transfer ownership from Habitat being the owner to the cooperative being the owner. And so that's what ended up occurring. They did end up having, they assumed the loan, one of the original development loans with IDA. So they assumed that loan. They had a new loan with CCLF, and they had a legacy loan with Habitat for monies that we had advanced them to sustain the building in some earlier years. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's.
Yeah, can I add?
Yeah.
So low income housing tax credit after the 15-year period. So the investor and the developer become part of a limited partnership that owns the co-op. And at the end of year 15, so that the investor gets their benefit over a 10-year period, but they have to stay in for an additional 5 years. At that point in time, they can get out. So this is also a negotiation up front, so that the investor knows that you want them to get out for $1. They're not going to get, they're not going to be whole or otherwise. And so they, there's not really a payment at the end if you negotiate this ahead of time. And a lot of the not-for-profit investment corporations, like the National Equity Fund, have gotten out for $1 and out of LIHTC deals. And then the ownership structure at that point is when the co-op corporation takes ownership of the properties, the ownership entity of the co-op, right? And as opposed to the limited partnership. And this is a really important transaction. And then as far as loans go, I think Jen summed it up nicely. Any of the loans that were used that have those affordability requirements, and believe me, they're there and they're gigantic. They just, as long as they're assumable, and that's been negotiated ahead of time with IDA and the city, then they transfer, they are assumed by the new co-op corporation entity. That's how the takeout typically is designed to work.
Thank you. Go ahead, Demario.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did not mean to say anything. I thought I was still muted. I apologize.
Oh, that was a great mini workshop, Joy.
Yeah. Focusing on the exit, and I love the questions on the exit. It's so critical and so important.
Cammie, did you have a question?
Yeah, I don't know, my camera's not working for some reason, but Joy, in a perfect world, would the option to transition to a co-op be written into the project documents and plans and all that kind of stuff at like LIHTC award? Like, is it that early?
So this is something that is woven into all of your documents. By the time you get to that closing table, the co-op corporation has already been established. And the issue is, and here's the rub, right? They don't really own anything, right? They own the share values, right? They own the shares. But other than that, they don't really own the buildings because the buildings have to be owned by the limited partnership, because that's how the low-income housing tax credit works. That's how the investor gets their benefit. So, but yes, everything has to be negotiated up front. Everybody has to know everything so that once you close on financing, you've got a co-op corporation established, your limited partnership, the takeout, the assumability of the loans have been established. The investor knows that the plan for the takeout is for the developer who's the general partner, and the investor who's the limited partner are going to get out for nothing or close to nothing and then the co-op corporation comes in and acquires for that nominal, hopefully nothing consideration.
So thank you. I'm not deep into the LIHTC world at IDA. So, but what you're saying is that I guess I always assumed, probably incorrectly, that a LIHTC deal is up and running, and at some point between year 3 and year 15, the ownership decides they may be interested and it would be evolving. Like, I didn't realize that at the inception of a project, the idea of it transitioning to a co-op in year 15, I didn't think that that would always be front and center or even decided at year 1. But what you're saying is that it really should be.
Ideally, you want it to be upfront. That's in my opinion. There's nothing that would prevent necessarily from making that decision later on, but it's a little more complicated because then you're really starting from ground zero. And you've got things that you already had woven into all your documents, you have to sort of back into it.
I would echo that. I think that's a great takeaway. It's interesting with Winthrop. That was the original vision. They were the original residents were trained up on this is going to be a cooperative, but they didn't put the cooperative in place. So the memory stayed with many of the residents. They were going to be owners, and they kept that in their front of mind. We found a lot of those early documents, but it wasn't written into all the legal documents and everything. So, and the cooperative wasn't formed until 2014. So I think that if there's a way to your point, Joy, I think that's, right from the get-go, very early on, I think that's, it'll help it sustain the concept, make sure everybody knows from the beginning, this is how, what's supposed to happen here. So.
Yeah, it's certainly cleaner. It's certainly cleaner. I guess I just didn't realize that, that decision was already made. I thought it was something that would evolve as the life of the project lived on, and it was getting close to expiration in year 15. And what are we going to do? And maybe it'll be like, I thought it was more like that kind of organic discussion. But that's too loosey-goosey, it sounds like. And certainly understand if the financing has to be structured a certain way, you want it that way from day one. Okay, that helps me. Thank you.
This is Peter from UHAB, and Joy, I certainly agree with you that is ideal. And I know there's a project in DC which is in year 17 or so, but was established with a co-op as a co-general partner at day one. And the more you can have it up front, the more likely it is to happen. I mean, I think to your point, Cami, you're probably right that that's more commonly how people try to do it, but it's a lot. If it's hard, as you were saying, Jen, it's hard enough to do it, when it was envisioned from the beginning, and it's even hard to do it when you had the co-op as a co-general partner, all along. But I mean, it is possible to do it later, and we've been exploring with some groups who've been trying that, but it's a lot harder, and especially if you don't have it all baked into it, there's investors who don't want to let it go for $1. That, oh, maybe they thought, we thought they were saying that, but no, they really weren't. Or, boy, this property's worth a lot more than we envisioned it would be. And, all those things can go wrong. And the ones we found that were most ripe, sort of, group wanting it to turn into a co-op might be ones that are really in trouble. And that's really sort of like, how do we get rid of this? And that's not what you want the co-op to start out with either. Doing it from day one is certainly the most straightforward. Not that that's simple.
Right. I think when we looked across the equity funds around the country, a lot of these deals always asked in the application, what's the outcome? What's going to happen after the end of the period? And they often said that they'll be offered to the residents. And so, and that may be all there is, but there are also projects where no one paid attention to that, after 15 years, except the residents. And then we've had these uncomfortable confrontations where the residents are asserting their right to become a co-op. And so, and there are, I know in New York State and maybe in California as well and other places, credit was given, extra credit in the application process for saying that you were going to turn it over to the residents at the end. So it was a very common thing to put in there. And over the years, we've heard from, the various equity funds and other developers that, oh, this is it's in our documents. So what do we do? But I think building it in so it's an easy transition would make a lot of these much easier, because often it's just an indication, yeah, that's our intention. And then carrying it out, who's going to do the work, who's going to pay for people to do the work, who's going to pay for all the legal work. And it's a big, difficult problem. And as Peter said, all of a sudden a neighborhood that wasn't valuable at all is worth a lot. And you have investors who think they deserve a piece of that, which they don't. But
thanks, Andy, and thanks, Peter. And it's a great segue to introduce Andy and Peter, who have been part of this work for a while. You are next on our agenda, so it's a fantastic segue. And it sounds like a lot of us are circulating around a number of key points. One being plan the exit at the point of the entry. Always a good idea for kind of complicated transactions. Peter and Andy, we were going to show the Seabury Co-op video. I think what I'm going to do instead, since we have you both and we really just segued into this concept of planning the exit, and want to turn to you about talking about, I think, a conversion of a HUD building to a co-op. I'm going to post the video into the chat so everyone has it. It's a great 8.5-minute overview from the resident perspective and developer perspective on how Seabury has maintained sustainability and viability as a very successful co-op. So that is now in the chat for you all. But I wanted to turn the floor over to you, either to talk about Seabury or some of your other experience. As you've heard Jen and Joy talk, great amount of detail and enthusiasm about the LIHTC to co-op conversion. So we're hoping you could, round out the conversation, maybe talking about some HUD to co-op conversions that you've been a part of, and what you've seen as measures of success or indicators of success and sustainability.
Well, I guess one thing on that, I guess what I would say, we haven't really worked on HUD to co-op conversions, the HUD finance buildings. I think the bigger issue is preserving the HUD co-ops. They're already co-ops, but they're, in deep need of all the same things that you were finding with the neglected LIHTC, that they need the training, they need and frequently need renovation.
Go
ahead, Andy.
Yeah, as I say, we've done some conversions of HUD properties, but they're all sort of failed, distressed HUD properties. We've had a judge take the building away from HUD and the owner and give it to the residents. We've had, scandal projects in New York that, so forth that we've done. But I think, as Peter says, we haven't done any direct conversions, but I think that the Seabury one is emblematic of what happens to a lot of co-ops because they've been around so long. Seabury is 50 years old. For example, Seabury was built at a time when I think the phrase was too cheap to meter, when electricity was so cheap that nobody really cared about it. So it was built with electric heat and no insulation. And so their major problem when we they had two problems. One is they couldn't pay their electric bills, and the utility in New Haven was going to foreclose on them. But the other is what we see in co-ops across the country, the HUD co-ops, is they often become captive of their management companies. And more the management company sort of takes control. There may be a leader, but the leader in the management company, and there just isn't democracy. Democracy disappears. The sense that we own this, that we're a co-op, begins to disappear, and they just look like a landlord building, and people in the buildings sort of forget or come in really not knowing what it is. And in the HUD buildings, in those originally the purchase of membership looked a lot like a security deposit. So it didn't really, they were in the hundreds or low thousands of dollars. So that getting into the co-op was not a large mortgage that you were paying off or anything. So it's easy to forget without education. So it really speaks to the need for the ongoing education and the ongoing technical assistance, the stewardship that everybody talks about, and having to have the ecosystem that they're talking about in Chicago to support co-ops. And that, as we like to say, housing is not building it. It's not the financing and construction. It's what happens in the next 50 years. And now we know beyond 50 years, and some of the older co-ops in New York are approaching 100 years old. So that's what's really important. What happened in Seabury is that their management just did not keep up with their building. They were failing their REAC inspections, the physical inspections that HUD requires of all buildings. They weren't correcting those problems. And the board really was incapable of figuring out what to do next, and they weren't getting any help, and the economics of the building were spiraling down. We got called in, actually, it was the Green Bank of Connecticut that had a number of co-ops, both HUD financed and state Connecticut Housing Finance Agency funded, that were all in this, and a lot of it was energy caused problems. And so they saw a role to fix it. And I think you'll see that in a lot of older buildings, not just co-ops, but all of them, that what they need now is an energy upgrade. And it's a perfect time for that. So redoing the co-op. Just the story that you'll see the end of, but what happened in Seabury, just very briefly, is that we had worked out a private loan from a foundation that we were able to give them to sort of bridge to either a new or an FHA loan. They had a 236 or something, or to the Connecticut Housing Finance Agency loan. And we were going to give them a bridge to redo the REACs and all that stuff, and to pay off the utility. Congress went into their rescission or their whatever when they stopped and they closed, and we were sitting there with the utility threatening to foreclose instantly, and we had to make a choice of just using our own money to bail them out for until Congress reopened or not. So we got to be heroes by saying, well, we'll do this. It can't, how bad can it be? And anyways, it took any number of years to overcome the reacts, including having to replace a few elevators. But and the Housing Authority in New Haven came in with some project-based Section 8, which allowed them to really increase their income. So now they're on our loan was taken out by Leviticus, which is a loan fund in our region. And they're waiting for their Connecticut Housing Finance Agency to do a full $4.5 million, I think, rehab. But the big piece of the work that we did was reorganizing, putting essentially an organizer in there to work with the board, having elections, getting new officers. HUD asked for the manager to be removed, and some of the residents refused. So they have co-management. I don't know when the management will get fixed, and that still remains a problem. But as you can see, that in older co-ops, and the strength of a co-op is really in the love that they have for their co-op. It's just, I think that's what you see in the film. So.
Right. The one other thing that Seabury highlights is that the value of having somebody who has some authority through a regulatory agreement to keep on top of things. I mean, typically the regulatory agreements that we work with require, for instance, a 2% increase in rent or carrying charges every year, which is the kind of thing boards hate to do. But it's, of course, in the long run, crucial that those things happen. And, that somebody is looking, I mean, I don't think we've ever actually implemented it, but the regulatory agreement allows the board to be replaced, or I think it's, the regulatory group can name enough people to the board to form a majority when the loan is in default. And this is both helpful. The truth is, it's helpful to the residents as well as to the lender. That the lender doesn't really typically want to foreclose, and the residents certainly don't want to be foreclosed on. But when it gets into a really hard spot, how do you get out of it and keep the co-op? And ideally, how do you prevent even getting in the hard spot? But training, of course, is one piece of it, but making sure there are elections, and then, of course, technical assistance along the way to help figure out how do you upgrade the utilities. And we have a program working with co-ops, but it's work to get a board to agree to take on this new loan, even if we can look at it and say it's a 3-year payback. How could you not do this loan? Well, it's a volunteer board who's like, oh my God, we're going to be borrowing tens of thousands of dollars. That's a lot of money.
Millions.
Or right. If it's only tens of thousands, but it typically isn't. It's typically millions. With the new federal grant possibilities, it can be much less. But even so, it isn't even practically free. Isn't free.
Right. And that's really the Connecticut Green Bank experienced that in these older co-ops all across the state. And then, so we worked with 3 or 4 or even more of them. And that was really the assignment, was help them understand their budgets and what this loan would mean, and feel confident enough to sign up for this new loan. So I think it really speaks to the sort of long-term work with making sure that existing co-ops sort of get the training, technical assistance they need.
Andy and Peter, we have a few questions posted in the chat that I'll read in just a moment. I want to invite everyone else to put in their questions, either come off of mute and ask their questions or put additional questions in the chat. Just thinking about our last 25 minutes together, I think we want to allow at least 10 minutes for a general discussion. We've prepared some questions that will help us lead to some of the recommendations in the report, and then the last couple minutes for next steps. So I think we have 5 to 10 minutes to really continue to ask Andy and Peter about their experience. And so the first two are with respect to the Seabury, is this managed by the same longtime property manager, or can you tell us in general across buildings like the Seabury how they've addressed longtime property management? That was one of the discussions we had. And then yeah, so go ahead and answer that one. And then we've got a few more that have popped up.
They had put in a co-manager, and I'm not quite sure how that worked. And I don't know if the longtime manager has exited, but we now have a very strong board and board leadership that holds management accountable for the work that has to be done, which is really the important thing. And I can check to see whether the longtime manager is there or not.
Great, thank you. And is that the same? Do you kind of see that trend across a lot of the buildings you work with, that longtime property manager?
It is. I mean, I think that's the managers, they get comfortable. The few leaders who are there and there isn't regular elections and they don't change are all comfortable and they work together, and that's where the building is. And then when the budget crisis or the heat crisis or physical, failing the HUD inspections comes in, then they're in problem. It's not just HUD buildings, it's in all older co-ops with management. I should say for our UHAB buildings, we have 1,300 co-ops in New York. I think about 75% of them are self-managed. They don't have managers. So that's a whole different issue, which is, the same pattern can happen where the leaders and the self-managers sort of get into this pattern and people view them as landlords, and there isn't a robust board of directors and a democratic process that holds them accountable and so forth. So that requires regular training, but it's also part of the monitoring that we do, which requires annual elections. The regulatory agreement says you have to have an annual election. And so in our monitoring, we proactively reach out to buildings, say you need help with the election, you want us to come observe. In very large buildings, which ours aren't for the most part, but we actually can do election services where we can do ballots that can be scanned electronically, or we can just count the ballots if there's contention elections. So that's, and it also requires that they do an annual budget, and we proactively reach out to all those buildings and say, do you need help during your budget? Send us this year's past actuals, and we can prepare a preliminary budget that the board can review, and we can help you do that. So those two things really both keep the board active and keep information in front of the board so they know what's happening. And I think those are two good preventatives for that.
Andy, just to follow up on that. So you said 75% are probably self-managed, and you referenced size. Are those then smaller? Like what size?
They actually vary in size. Big or small doesn't really matter. Although you're hard pressed to get a manager who wants to work on a very small building, a 6-unit building, 4-unit building, a 10-unit building. There just isn't enough fee in there for a manager to come, especially because they've got to come to a monthly board meeting and do all the other things that a co-op requires of them. So self-management it tends to be in smaller buildings, but it works perfectly well in the larger buildings. And although our city will say that all new projects have to be managed by outside managers, the facts are that the sort of rate of buildings going into having problems or going into this distress is no different for managed buildings than for self-managed buildings. You have, I don't know, depending upon what you call distress, but it might be 80 or 85% of the buildings in either case do equally well. And then you have some 20 or 15% of the buildings that sort of fall behind. They might have physical problems they can't deal with or whatever, but the managers don't do any better than the others. And we're beginning to experience some sort of management induced problems where they have had buildings take out loans and so forth that are totally unsupportable and it made no sense, and they just put them through. I mean, we're beginning to, so there's some management problem, but there also are problems that, you have to be able to support and train and assist the self-managers, and so that's important as well.
Thank you, Andy. I want to get Janae into the conversation and then go back to, I think, two of our final questions before we have a few general questions that we could all engage with.
So, and Peter and Andy, let me say, as you know, I copycat everything you do here in Chicago. So really the idea of whether it be the long-time board member or the long-term property manager, I think we need to really think about not only the fact that people get complacent, right, and go for the easy route. One of the things that we started at CSO is doing individual owner assessments, right, as part of our memorandum of agreement to work with them. And the individual owner assessment goes to the owners and say, hey, members, how is your board working? Who are you in this building? What is that you don't like, right? And I will tell you, even in my condo, which I keep trying to make them work like a co-op, they're getting there, not quite. We do that, right? We have asked as members of the association that any vendor that has more than 3 to 5 years of a contract with us must be evaluated by the members, right? And that, again, not only engage others, right? It engage those that don't want to come to the meetings, those that feel that the trainings are too much kumbaya for them, right? But it gives them an idea of best practice, and are we part of that best practice or not, right? So I think one of the things that I learned in organizing HUD co-ops, right, to not sell, right, to not get out of the HUD program, what I've learned is, and for me personally, as a consultant doing this work out here right now, if I see a property that has had the same board or the same board president for more than 5 years, that's a trigger. We should recognize that, right? Because then that's complacency, right? And that we should be asking what's going on at this property at this time. In the Illinois law for condos, and co-ops kind of fit under that piece as well, it requires that there is member quorum for the budget meeting as well as the annual meeting, right? And again, if all of that is baked into the beginning, the development stage and all that, then those coming in understand that at the very least, right, there are 2 key meetings they must participate in as members. And so again, it's how do we, and not only educate the members, but how do we educate all stakeholders? Because many times when an owner has a problem with their, controlling board or controlling, I'm going to say vendor, because I can say the same thing about lawyers, right? Some lawyers run some buildings, right? So when we have these kind of controls that people are feeling unable to break through, they'll go to their alderman, they'll go to whomever it is that they think can make a decision, right? And that's why, again, I also believe that if there is a shared ownership property in any community, that all stakeholders should be educated on how that property is run. The last thing I will say is when that kind of complacency occurs, and it shocks me every time I hear that a co-op member can rent their unit out. People, it's happening out here, right?
Well,
and so then the
subletting-
question is, what's going on?
Yeah, subletting is a big problem, and it's generally regulated in the regulatory agreement or in the bylaws and so forth. It's required in our co-ops. I think doing your member owner surveys is great. We have a checklist that we, a good co-op, healthy co-op checklist that we often go over with boards and supply boards so that some of these questions get asked. We don't have an opportunity to be as intimate with each shareholder as you do, because we have so many buildings, and that can be a problem. But one of the things, if you listen to Oscar when he does some training around our work that we do with co-ops, our technical assistants, he'll say that what's most important is building a relationship with the co-op so that you get to know people, and you get to hear those things as well. The one other thing I should say, as you say, you need to educate everybody about this. I think we're all in a way complicit in this. I mean, if you ask yourself, so which phone numbers and emails do I have for that co-op? You've got the president and maybe one other board member, the treasurer. You don't have any depth. You call the same person because you can know. We are always struggling that you call the president and say, well, we need to make a decision whether we're going to do this or that. It's not theirs to make the decision, it's the board. But things move quickly, there's pressure. So we all need to check ourselves and say, one, it's going to be a little slower and more difficult because democracy is a little difficult. And two, we need to be clear that it's a board decision and not really facilitate the leaders of a building sort of supplanting the decision-making powers and the powers of the board, because they make good decisions, things will be fine, but eventually you'll run into that you don't have the board strength and the democracy there that you need when things get difficult.
Thanks for that, Andy. So I've been monitoring the chat and the time. We're down to 12 minutes. This time has gone by way too quickly. So I want to ask one more question of Andy and Peter, and then we posed 4 different discussion questions. We're hoping we could just respond to them as you fit. They're in the chat. So when you want to offer a response to those discussion questions, just come on off of mute and share your thoughts. But Andy and Peter, the last questions that I'll kind of merge into one question. How do you think, and how have you dealt with sustainability from a new membership perspective, as you have share members who are either moving or maybe transitioning and need to fill those shares with new members? What has been the strategy for that? And related question is, what kind of certainty can developers be provided if they're engaging in a tech development, that the co-op member interests, the interest of co-op members will be there upon conversion? There's a general question about attracting new residents, new share members.
Yeah,
go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I would say on the last part, we work with buildings sort of when we get a sort of 80%, we're looking for sort of 80% interest before we go in. We'll do some education about what the option is. If you're going to convert a building at the end of its tax credit life or any other building that's going through a transition, we go into them when we have a 80% petition or a established tenant association resolution that really represents that number of residents. And we don't want to go and essentially do a building if we don't have that support. So on that side. In terms of new residents, in recent years, City of New York has a lottery to fill vacancies on all new developments, conversions, and others. So we get to the end of a conversion of a building and we have 15 vacancies. We have to do it through the city's online lottery system, which is very cumbersome and very time consuming. But the one thing that we insist upon as part of that is that people take a sort of home ownership workshop. And so they come to a couple hours, hour or two, or whatever it is, and learn about what does it mean to live in a limited equity co-op, particularly in a city like Chicago, where you have market rate buildings, so that they really know that when you're going to sell, this is what you're going to do. And these are your rights and responsibilities. And these are what you're going to have to pay. And these are how the monthly charges, will escalate, and all the things they need to know, and how they get to be part of the governance and actually what they own. So that education is what we do. The system we designed before the city took it over with a lottery was to sort of do our own kind of waiting list. And so we would have these every month. We would do these co-op homeowner workshops. People would come to them, and then if they were interested, they could fill out an interest. And so we created an interest pool with sort of on a first come, first served basis, where family size and neighborhood you were interested in, and sort of sometimes the income or the price of what the units would be. And so we had a ready-made interest pool that we could provide to to buildings. And we actually have what we call market and match, where we can help buildings select people. We can help them with the interviewing, train them so that they don't get in trouble with fair housing kinds of issues, and provide a whole level of service in finding residents. And then the very last piece of it is we discovered that you could do all that, but nobody could get a share loan. If you needed a $15,000 or a $25,000 or $35,000 share loan, all of our banks would say yes. And then 2 years later, their credit committee was still struggling with it. So we started our own share loan program to try to meet that, and which I know is share loans are an issue in Chicago.
And in terms of how do you know if you start out with a LIHTC building intending to be a co-op? I think as Joy was saying, you really want to be sort of, and Jen, you really want to be doing education all along, and really have that co-op have a meaningful role during those 15 years when they're not owners, but they can have a meaningful role in the property. And that's really what both makes it a better property during those 15 years, and then makes the transition to a co-op much smoother. But there will be cases where, for whatever reason, I mean, we find it's about 2% of buildings we work with, that could really be affordable co-ops and choose not to be. And there are reasons that the residents may say, look, we want this nonprofit to keep owning it. And that's not a failure. That's their decision. But usually they if we've trained them and structured it properly, they're going to choose the co-op.
There's James has a great comment in the chat. I won't read it out loud, so I'll just refer everyone to that. Kimberly has a question that I think we should try to address, and then we have probably another minute or two for 1 to 2 more comments, either related to the discussion or related to any of the questions in the chat. Kimberly's question is, how is the resale restriction structured and related to specific shareholder needs?
Typically, the way we have them is that there is in the documents a chart which says this is what each unit can be resold for each of the next 40 years. And so it's very clear that you're paying, $12,000 for your unit in 2024, and in 2048 it's going to be $14,127. And so it formulas can be confusing. We've found really just having charts makes it very, very clear.
Right. And generally the chart is 3% a year increase. Some of them are 2.5.
I'm also asking the question for the structure, like the content I think is really interesting. So how much it can sell for, but all these other things that you might want to include in a resale restriction. There's so many things that to think about, but I guess also for financing purposes and for getting public funds, how is it structured in terms of a restriction on the property, or a restriction that ties out to an individual buyer, so that it can, because I think that impacts how financing works, right? I mean, this is not the area.
Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, they're in a regulatory agreement generally, at least for the first 40 years. And the regulatory agreement would require certain things that actually go into the bylaws, but it's certain practices about resale. And one is, if it's required to do it through the city's lottery system, that's in there. Previously, it's required to go to a waiting list, and the co-op is required to keep waiting lists. One for insiders who want to move to a different size apartment if it becomes available, and then for outsiders who want to get the move into the building. And then there are income restrictions as to what the income of the incoming member can be. And those are things that the monitor, the regulatory agreement requires that there be a monitor, somebody who is hired by the building to oversee resales, check on sublets, to make sure they're within the rules, to make sure there's the annual budget, to make sure there's an annual election, to make sure that the reserves are there, that the utilities are being paid. We're the monitor on most of the buildings, and we are named on the insurance. So we'll get a notice if insurance is being canceled, and all those things. And so we watch over the building, and annually, sometimes we're asked to do a walkthrough to make sure it looks okay. Not that we're technically able to do beyond that. And there's a whole lot of other things, and depending upon the lender or the agency, there may be other features in there about how the reserves are structured, or releasing money from reserves, or so forth. So a lot of that is just built into the regulatory agreement, which sort of says, put this in your bylaws, or this needs to be in your proprietary lease. But that's a set of rules.
So it's structured like a rental deal. That's how you're doing it.
But
The
regulatory, right. The regulatory things are structured very much like like the same regulatory, and the loans look very much like a rental deal because they're tied to the real estate, not to the individuals. That's what allows you to serve very low income people, is that the credit is the real estate. It's not the individual credit of each individual. That's why limited equity co-ops are helpful.
So we're just at about time, and I know we could continue the discussion for quite a bit. I wanted to make sure that we end on time and end with some very clear next steps. So this was Task Force 4 out of 4, and we'll look at distributing a survey next week that asks you for your input about how the meetings have proceeded and have gone. And we'll also give you a chance to, synthesize any last thoughts you didn't get to contribute to to this meeting. We'll look at a draft report in May, probably early May. We're hoping to have a comment period in mid-May to the end of May. And that comment period will be for everyone who's been part of the task force, as well as IDA and some of the other agencies, State Senator Simmons. And then hopefully we'll have a report release and a celebration in June. So stay tuned for follow-up dates. On behalf of Kevin, Rachel, and Janae, all the CSO and CRN colleagues, just want to extend really deep appreciation and gratitude for your participation today. As we mentioned, there's cumulatively more than, I think now that Andy and Peter have joined, more than 300 years of accumulated expertise and wisdom. So you can see we've got a lot to synthesize and a lot to provide in terms of education recommendations and education. So thank you for joining us this morning, and stay tuned for the next steps. Hope you all have a wonderful day.